In the wake of this weekend's shootings in El Paso, Texas, and in Dayton, Ohio, that claimed the lives of some 30 people, President Trump made a statement condemning violence, condemning racism, condemning hatred, and also implicating violent video games, and by extension, violent movies, although he didn't explicitly mention movies. This is Bill Whittle now. I'm Scott Ott, and Bill, the president made this statement that nobody really expected him to make. He didn't bring up the thing that everybody talks about after one of these mass shootings, but he did talk about keeping mentally ill people, what they call red flag laws, to take guns out of the hands of mentally ill people who might be a danger to themselves and to others. First of all, what do you just think of the president's general approach to this moment, this fraught and the moment when the whole country is grieving, and he comes out with a statement that kind of runs against what everybody would expect?
In other words, he didn't come out and say that we should get rid of guns.
In essence, yes, although he did talk about getting them out of the hands of mentally ill people with these
now
red
we're
flag
talking
laws.
About something that actually makes some sense. I don't even know where to begin with this. I really would like to know, I'm surprised I don't have this number at my fingertips, but I would like to know what percentage of these mass shooters belong to the NRA? Because I bet it's not many. Look, there are some things that you can prove, just logically prove, and it's really not too tough. Sometimes when there's a correlation, there's a causality. One is causing the other, sometimes just randomly going in the same direction. But here's one thing that we absolutely can say with certainty. 50, 60 years ago, when I was born, let's say in 1959, guns were everywhere. Every single kid had toy guns. They had guns that would assemble into different guns, and you could put a bipod on that and make it into a machine gun and all the rest of it. You could buy real guns in Sears, in Penny's, in any department store, in any hardware store. You started with a BB gun when you were 7, 8, 9, and if you took care of that and you didn't shoot anybody's eye out, then maybe you got a .22 and so on. Ever since the time I was born, it has been harder and harder and harder and harder and harder to get guns. The availability of guns has not increased over the last 60 years. The availability of guns has dramatically decreased, and the perception of guns in our society has also dramatically decreased. Every high school used to have a shooting team. Kids used to wear their 6 shooters on their hips when they just go out playing in the yard.
Now, Bill, can I ask you about that stat? Because you're saying the availability of guns, you mean where they're available or the number of guns sold? What are you saying is decreased over the years?
I am saying that the ease of walking in someplace and buying a weapon has become harder and harder and harder and harder to do that. You could have gone in 1965, you could have gone to a Sears store and you could have bought as many guns as you could carry out of the store. So one thing we know is that the difficulty of getting guns is getting more and more difficult as time goes on, and the shootings are increasing as well, which tells me that it's not the guns. So what has changed in the last 60 years? Well, I personally have to be very, very clear on this. I do think video game violence, and I do think that, let's just call it violence porn in movies, tends to desensitize people to some of this. But if I believe that those things were responsible for this shooter, then I would basically be taking a position saying that all people are robots, and it's just a matter of what you saw last on TV, and then you just snap and go out and do something. And the only solution to that problem, if that's the case, is for everybody to speak in such language that the most mentally unstable of us don't ever get upset or get any ideas of any kind. And that's not something I'm willing to do. Now, when Donald Trump says, get the guns out of the hands of the mentally ill, I think that is precisely where we should be concentrating, Scott. What can you call somebody who could do something like this?
Well, here's what the American Psychological Association calls it. I'm reading right now from their statement, and they say that the shooting is being investigated as a hate crime, and he's talking about the one in El Paso, as it should be. Psychological science has demonstrated the damage that racism can inflict on its targets. Racism has been shown to have negative cognitive and behavioral effects on children and adults. And then they go on to say routinely blaming mass shootings on mental illness is unfounded and stigmatizing. So essentially what they're saying is, I mean, you're kind of using, I forget what the Latin term for this is, but you're using an argument to basically say, look, if you shot a whole bunch of people, you're mentally ill. Therefore, even if they didn't diagnose you beforehand, you had a mental illness. Therefore, these people who do these shootings are mentally ill. The Psychological Association says, no, actually the problem here is racism, and they don't come right out and say it, but a lot of Democrats have. The President of the United States has done more than his fair share of ginning that up. Okay,
well, first of all, they're wrong. That's the first thing. When they say that only 25% of the mass shooters have been previously diagnosed, that's a fairly high percentage, 1 out of 4. And just because they hadn't been treated before doesn't mean that they weren't crazy. And for the American Psychiatric Association to say that we don't want to stigmatize crazy people by associating them with these shootings, but we do want to stigmatize all the people that voted for Donald Trump and all the people who think that the guns need to be taken away, all of those law-abiding citizens, they need to be stigmatized because we don't want to upset any of the mentally ill people that do this kind of thing. Now, if the American Psychiatric Association is telling me that a person who can walk into a department store and kill 22 people is clinically sane, I'd really like to hear the explanation of that. I really would, because it is Scott, it's just so self-evident. This is not something a sane person does. Let me tell you what's happened here.
But their point is it's not useful for diagnosis because not all mentally ill people behave this way. So saying that it's a problem of mental illness is not really doing anything.
Well, if they're telling me that 25% of the shooters have a previous diagnosis, it doesn't mean that the other ones weren't crazy, but 25% have a diagnosis, that's a statistically significant number. What percentage of gun owners shoots people? What percentage of Donald Trump voters? Is it 1 in 150 million? That's not 25%, Scott.
And that's actually the next question I wanted to ask you, because when you get right down to it, I mean, this is a reductionist argument, because what percentage of gun owners have actually engaged in these kind of shootings? What percentage of the mentally ill? What percentage of video gamers or people who watch violent video games or movies? What percentage of white people do this? What percentage of men do this? What percentage of 18 to 25-year-olds do this? All of this would lead one to just throw up one's hands and say, well, there must be nothing at all we can do about it because the needle in the haystack is so small we will never find it. So let's just stop talking about it and accept mass shootings as a part of life.
It's not a needle in a haystack. It's a pitchfork on top of a couple of toothpicks. It's not hard at all to figure out what's happening. And if you don't take my word for it, and you don't have to, the people that study this, that study mass shootings, forensic psychologists, these are people who go in often after a massacre and try to put together the pieces of what made that person do what they do. The lead, and I've forgotten his name, but I will have it in a day or two. The lead forensic psychologist for the FBI who studied mass shootings said there is one way and one way only to avoid these kind of things in the future. Here are the things that we need to do. Never mention the shooter's name. Never show the shooter's face. Never give a body count, never rank it among where it fits in all these other atrocities. Make it a localized news story to the degree you can, and stop handing the Willy Wonka golden ticket to people who are suicidal and who now have a chance to get their faces on every TV screen and computer screen in the world. The one thing we didn't have before these school shootings started was CNN. And by CNN, I mean 24-hour news cycle. That's what I mean. I don't mean them specifically, although certainly they contribute to it. What you've got is, well, first of all, you've got a country of 350 million people. And the number of them that go off the edge and start shooting is a pretty small number. It's 2 in 350 million this particular weekend. But put that aside. Put all that aside. 50, 60 years ago, guns were available anywhere and any time. You could just walk in any place and get them. They were easy to get. They've gotten harder and harder and harder. Background checks and all the criminal record checks and all the waiting periods in California and all the rest have gotten much harder. You could just walk into Sears and just come out with an armful of them. So the availability of guns and the restrictions on guns has caused the number of shootings to go up. I don't think that's a causality, but I'll tell you what I do think is a causality. I agree with the president to a degree. Without question, some of this video game violence and some of this, let's call it violence porn in movies like The Matrix, tend to desensitize people to these kind of things. And then when you're talking about your 7, 8 sigmas out on the far end of the bell curve, that might be enough to nudge people slightly. But I want to be crystal clear on this. If I thought that anything that a movie or a video game or a president said actually caused somebody to go out and start gunning down innocent people, then I would think that people are simply robots who are determined by whatever the last input they happen to get is. And I don't believe that at all. The person who's responsible for the shooting is the person that did the shooting. And until we understand that, we're not going to get anywhere. And until we also understand that the complexity of this issue is not something that the progressive left particularly wants to deal with, because the main thing that's changed, Scott, in the last 50, 60 years, and let me just recap what I mean by this. There were no mass shootings prior to Johnson administration, not since the Old West anyway. And even then, the OK Corral gunfight, which was 4 people killed, made such a splash that it just went down in history for the rest of time. Johnson administration, 1 mass shooting at the University of Texas. Nobody during Nixon's 2 terms, no one during Ford, no one during Carter, 3 during Reagan, something like 5 or 6 during Clinton, 7 or 8 for Bush, 24 for Obama. And none of that has anything to do with the presidents or anything else. What it has to do with is it has to do with this instantaneous celebrity for people who are suicidal in the first place. And this is the part of it that nobody talks about. And if you don't understand this, you will never understand any of it. Nobody goes into those situations, the shooters now. None of them go into that situation planning to murder a bunch of people, then get out in a getaway car driven by a friend and make a run for it. Every single one of them is expecting to, and most of them do, go down in a blaze of gunfire, which means it is a suicide act is what it is. It's an act of suicide. It's suicide by cop. But if CNN is going to be there and you're going to get yourself killed by cops, why not get your face on every single TV screen and your name as well? If you're bitter and resentful and angry and suicidal, I'm not saying that's not a problem. That's needless to say, that's a very serious problem. But you are handing people who feel anonymous, who feel worthless, who feel like they don't exist, you are handing them international celebrity and fame by doing this. And it's not me saying this, although it makes perfect sense to me. This is what the people who study mass shooters say. But nobody's going to deal with that. No one's going to address that. Because if you did address that, you would have to start to address the fact that the main thing that has changed in this country in the last 60 years is there are far fewer people going to church. There are far fewer people in intact families. There are far fewer people with good fathers. And that's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. So if the American Psychiatric Association thinks that it's defaming crazy people by me saying that crazy people go into malls and shoot up people, well, then you can go ahead and defame me, because I don't see how you possibly can rationalize that as the act of a sane person, since there is no plan for escape.
Well, Bill, I don't think they're arguing that it's the act of a sane person. I think that what they're saying is by talking constantly after these shootings about mental illness, as if you had to be worried about every mentally ill person on your block, you're doing a disservice to the mentally ill. And scientifically, it's just as accurate as being able to randomly pick somebody out of what used to be called a phone book.
Okay, so we can't do that. We don't want to say mentally ill people might do mentally ill things. Right? Because that might offend or stigmatize mentally ill people. But we are willing to stigmatize
racists,
hundreds of millions of people who have guns in this country, and we are willing to stigmatize the half of the country that voted for Donald Trump. We're ready to do that in a heartbeat, and we've been doing it for 20 years. So if what you're telling me is that the American Psychiatric Association doesn't want to stigmatize crazy people, that is not a denial that it is crazy people doing this.
Yeah,
right?
and I want to be accurate, because it is the American Psychological Association who made no. I said it wrong at the first. In any case, Bill, it's possible that Congress will be called back into session. It is possible that the president will take some actions, either by making proposals or by actually doing executive orders like he did on the bump stocks before. but it just makes one wonder whether there's any way this country is ever going to come together on any solution, not just because of the divide on guns, but because of the disagreement over the effect of stigmatizing the mentally ill, because of the disagreement over the impact, scientifically measured or not, of violent video games, because of the disagreement about what role racism has to do with it, or whether the president is ginning it up or whether he is not. Do you see any hope going forward that there's anything that the federal government specifically can ever do to have an impact on this? You seem to suggest they should pass a law that says CNN can't say the name of the shooters and shouldn't publicize their manifestos.
That would do it.
So that you think that would be the single most valuable thing that the federal government could do? And are you okay with that?
It's not a question of whether I think that or not. This is what forensic scientists who study this problem think. Forensic psychologists, I'm sure, are members of the American Psychological Association think, and it's plainly true. But it's not just that news coverage, it's the complete failure of the societal cloth to catch these people the way they used to be caught in the past. And then we didn't make so many of them back then either, because we had more intact families, we had more guidance from parents, we had more guidance from fathers specifically. I would like to know how many of these shooters, since Columbine, let's say, had a good relationship with their father. I mean, a close relationship with their father. I'd like to know how many. Because the one thing I can recall about the Columbine shooters, parents, not grandparents, not uncles or second cousins, the parents said, we were completely unaware that our boys were trying to do something like this. And you know what? I believe them. I do. I believe them. I believe that they were so disengaged from what was happening in the life of their kids that they could not see the step-by-step progression that takes somebody from being a normal kid to being the kind of people that finds some other lunatic and decides to go out in a blaze of glory. And that's the term, by the way. That's the term. A blaze of glory. That's the term. That's what they're doing. That's precisely what they're doing. And that's why it is so shocking to us. It is a blaze of glory. And if you take away the glory, the blaze disappears. And if the blaze disappears, then the motive disappears. Now look, hang on. Now look, what you're basically asking for is you are saying we got to do something about murder. We got to do something about murder. We got to stop people from murdering people. I know the name of the first murderer, Scott, at least in terms of Western culture. Do you?
I've heard it, yeah. I read it in a book on a somewhat frequent basis.
Okay, so for 3,000 years, 4,000 years of written history, and certainly before then, this defect has existed in the human species, and it's not going away. It's not. Now, I will say this: this is one side of the argument I will give to the left. It is true that certain types of semi-automatic weapons allow a crazy person to do more damage than they would do with a bolt-action rifle, let's say. But that's still not. You're still talking about punishing the innocent. You're still talking about putting more restrictions and more opprobrium on people who are perfectly law-abiding people who have nothing to do with this. So, if you want to make it about Trump, be careful. You know, like I said, 7, 8, 9, and then Obama 24, I think it was during his 8 years in term. Be careful about that. What you're looking for is you are looking for a way to avoid the fact that this might happen to you. And now, my buddy, old Scott Ott, now we have finally arrived at the main vein. Now we're on the actual ore. 22 people killed in a shooting like this is probably a weekend in America's inner cities, at least that many. 22, 25 black men killed every single weekend in America, but they don't count. And the reason they don't count is because they're not a threat to liberals. You see, that's why they don't count. They don't count because they're not a threat to liberals. The reason that this kind of thing is so upsetting to liberals is because this kind of murder could touch them, and that's when they start to freak out. But as far as having 8,000 black Americans murdered every year in this country, in inner cities that have been run by Democrats for a century. That's not even on the radar. Nobody's even talking about that because those people don't matter to the Democrats. They're not useful to them politically. But the real driver is they know that as long as they stay in Bel Air and don't go to South Central at 2:00 in the morning, they don't have anything to be worried about in terms of murder. If you take away the inner cities, if you take away these lawless areas that Democrats have allowed to have this nightmare descend upon them, America has a lower homicide rate than Belgium does, lower than Switzerland. That's the murder rate in Plano, Texas. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to address the issue or are you not? Murder is murder. I would be in favor of anything that could predict or warn us about an individual who may be more prone to murder than others, but at the same time, I would want to know very clearly what that entailed, because the consequences of that may be, the cure may be worse than the disease.
There are two things I read, one thing I read and one thing I heard today, and I just want to end with this and get your reaction to it. One was a comment from a guy who has interviewed people who were involved in these kinds of mass shootings. And
you say interview, you mean shooters?
Yeah, the shooters
okay.
in some of these violent people. And one of the things, or studied them rather, some of them interviewed. But one of the things he pointed out was people have this common assumption that when something like this happens, somebody snapped. And he said, they don't snap.
No, they don't snap.
He said they've often been working on it for 2 years.
Yes.
And then the other thing, Bill, that's kind of somewhat related to this is National Public Radio had played some audio of people who were interviewed around the Dayton, Ohio shooting area. And when I heard this one young lady who went to high school with the shooter say, as soon as I heard that the shooter was from this high school, my first, she said, my first thought was, I'll bet it's, and then she named the guy. And she named him right? accurately, and it certainly was, yeah. And then when they talked to other people who went to school with him, not everybody he ever knew. Some people said he was a nice guy or whatever, but several people they talked to in his high school said, we could have seen this coming from a mile away, yeah.
Okay. So now we have a significant amount of evidence from the shooters and from the victims, from the people that knew them the best. We have a significant amount of evidence indicating. I never for a second thought that these people just snap, Scott. People don't just snap like that. I've never heard of such a thing really happening like that, which is why I'm saying that one of the things that's causing this is the absence of parents, especially fathers, because you don't suddenly go from being a happy-go-lucky ninth grader to planning to murder the entire high school the next day. It doesn't happen like that. It just doesn't. So if it turns out, as this seems to be case after case after case, here's what these shooters have in common. Well, there's a number of things they have in common. They're almost exclusively white. In fact, they are essentially they're all male, rather. Most of them are white. High percentage of them are white, young males, okay? And when you talk to the people that knew them before they committed these horrible acts, you get two flavors of responses and two flavors only. One of them is, he seemed like a nice guy, but he was very quiet, didn't talk to anybody. And he just didn't say much. We don't know much about him. He lived next door for 2.5, 3 years. We never really saw him or spoke to him. That's one reaction. And the other reaction is the one you just described. When I heard that this school got shot up, my first thought was, it was Jimmy Jenkins. Turns out it was. So if you want to prevent these things in the future, you may want to stop your madcap efforts to pull away guns from people who are hunting ducks out in Pennsylvania and start putting some of your efforts towards finding out which ones of these kids in school are the ones that all of the other students notice and are afraid of, or at the very, very least, if not afraid of them, certainly perturbed enough by their behavior prior to a massacre to not be surprised that it was them in the first place. That kind of prevention could actually work. But if you think you're going to get rid of murder completely, I'll just save you some time. And I mean no disrespect, and I mean no disrespect, and I don't mean to sound insensitive to the people who are grieving right now. This is not my intention. I'm not talking about individuals. We are talking about a societal issue here. I'm talking about mechanics of a machine that has 350 million moving parts, I don't for a second mean to think or suggest that I don't care about the people who got shot. As a matter of fact, I care enough about the people who got shot to be interested in finding out how to prevent people from actually being shot instead of this knee-jerk reaction that we hear every single time that has only made things worse and worse and worse.
On a personal note, I was walking through a mall last night. We went to see a movie after receiving this news, and the mall was packed, and it is in a suburban area of Dallas, Texas. And maybe it's just me. I doubt it. But as I was walking through this mall, I was scanning. I was looking at people. I was looking men mostly in the eye. Mm-hmm. I was keeping just kind of a broad perspective on everything that I was near to keep an eye out for that kind of a person. And I thought, why I shouldn't have to do this. I shouldn't have to even think about it.
Why?
There was a time when I would just walk through a shopping mall, have a great time, holding hands with my wife. But I am, and this is really since Virginia Tech, but I have had a sense of situational awareness every time I'm in a public place because I realized at some point I may be the one who's responsible for taking care of a situation that nobody else is really thinking could happen.
And what makes you think, with all due respect, that that's not your responsibility? I mean, who do we think we are? I don't understand this. I genuinely don't. Who do we think we are? That we would be free from murder, free from predation, free from insanity, that this Candyland world just existed. Who do we think we are? We didn't start creating murderers all of a sudden. We started publicizing them. But the idea that you can walk into a large group of strangers and not feel any sense of being responsible enough to see who looks like a threat to you is an artifact of the success of this system of government and the success of this economic system. That's what it is. And as that stuff unravels, so will your sense of security. And this is the price we pay for allowing people to do all the things that they said they were going to do and us going along with it.
Ladies and gentlemen, these shows that we do 48 episodes of each month at BillWhittle.com are made possible by the members at BillWhittle.com, and we thank them for their contributions to this effort. We couldn't do it without them. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this happen.